Hello. There are a lot of you. Okay, I am Margaret Staples, and I am presenting the talk Adventures in Symphony using open source software to make an MMO game, which is a thing that I did. It's nice to meet you. This is a talk about a big technical project that I did, but it doesn't make a lot of sense unless I frame it with a little bit of information about myself, so this is really kind of story time. So I grew up on Star Trek Next Generation, and I was very disappointed as I got older and realized that it was depicting a much more distant future than I realized. So basically my whole life I felt like I was living in the past. So when my elementary school got computers for the first time, I was like, yay! And basically I went to every computer class that was ever offered, but at the same time, I never really thought of myself as a programmer because that's something that like really, really smart people at NASA do. But then in high school, the web came out, and I thought that right-click view source was magic. And so I actually ended up spending much of my adult life making web pages for money, not because I was a programmer, but because I was a hack. It was like crafting, like arts and crafts and websites. So when I was 18, I was in a car accident and my spine exploded. And since then, every year I have less mobility and more pain. And by the time I was 30, I was confined completely to my bed, and I stopped being able to get those web design contracts because that required you to go out in the world, which I could not do anymore. So I spent like 4 of the last 5 years developing an online multiplayer social strategy city builder RPG called Brunelleschi Age of Architects because I needed something to do. And also because I knew that out there in the world there were a few fully remote programmer jobs that I wanted to become qualified for, and I am a learn by doing kind of person. So I came up with the biggest possible project ever, and I was pretty sure that if I just like kept working at it, it would teach me enough to get one of those very few jobs and I could stop being a poor person. So I had this big pile of stuff from when a friend of mine and I started a web development company back when the economy was like booming and money was falling from the sky, and we were like, hey, why not? That sounds like fun. And then like when we were partway through the alpha building stage, paying actual programmers to do that, the economy crashed and all of the investors went away, and we strung out our budget as long as we could, but eventually it was gone, and therefore the programmers were gone. And so I just had this pile of design documents and random art just laying around, and I'm like, hey, I'll start with this. So what I'm going to go over is the planning, core systems development, player testing, feature completion, and deployment of this project that took up like 4+ years of my life. All right, so planning. I had to go find, it had been a couple of years since the economy crashed and my company stopped being a fun project and started being a graveyard. And so I had to collect all of these Excel documents and all of these random piles of design notes and all of the art, and I had to figure out what was what and categorize it and analyze it to figure out what kind of structure would be needed to turn all of these ideas into like an interactable thing. So once I had all of the information kind of categorized and had like a vague idea of what all the pieces were, I had to put together like an implementation plan. And I knew full well that I was not in any position to come up with a plan that was going to work, but I had to start somewhere. And so I looked at all of the things and how they were going to interact because I'd done some work with databases in the past, and I knew that moving all of the data that was going to be interacting with each other from Excel documents and docs full of notes into some sort of like structure was going to be really important. And so I started by saying, okay, what's going to need to be part of the core database structure? And I came up with things like resources, buildings, goods, actions, units, classes, attributes, items, districts, and a whole lot of other things, but they kind of filled up the slide already. So the next thing I did was I said, I am not going to be able to invent all of these things like directly out of my brain with absolutely no outside influence. So what I decided to do was find a very thorough, well-developed, well-documented web framework, because web is where I was starting from. That was the basis of my knowledge. That also had a really active community, so when I inevitably did get stuck, there would be people who would give me opinions. So I set about learning the framework, and the reason that both of those words are in quotes is because I've never stopped learning. That's not like, it wasn't like beginning, middle, end, now I know everything. That just never happened. And also because it wasn't so much learning the framework as learning the fundamentals of all of the different components that I figured I would need to use to make this happen, like Doctrine and Twig, in addition to like, how do you install Symfony, what goes in which directories, that sort of thing. Okay, so then within the design documents, I identified what I thought of as the core systems of the game. So I would have like a foundation to start from. And I picked those based on what I had the most thorough documentation for the design of, and I felt that I had the strongest understanding of, and what I felt was most vital. Like, if you were going to cut away everything else and just have these things, it would still be a game worth having. And I identified harvesting, processing, crafting, training, building, actions, and leveling. Okay, so I had these ideas for my database, and now I wanted to fill them with actual data. And so the first thing that I did was I looked up the documentation for how to do that. And then I locked into fixtures as a thing that I could use to extract a bunch of that crap out of Excel sheets and put it into a database without me having to do it by hand until my fingers fell off. So basically, I put everything into Google Docs, and then so that they could be easily updated and be anywhere I needed to be on any computer I happened to have access to, because I don't know if you've ever been poor, but you just don't magically have access to a computer all the time. So I would export the design documents into CSVs, and then I would use the fixture thing. You would use those as exported files, and then I would just do that. Basically just run fixture command that just went through all of the things in the thing and put them into the database, and then I didn't have to worry about doing it by hand, and anytime I needed to change it, I could just change it in the Google Doc and then just do the process over again. It was super straightforward. It was like 5 seconds as opposed to like years of my life. Okay, so what this led me to understand was that during this process, I realized that I was like, the server was not going to be a matter of installing the framework or even just installing a repository. I was going to need the server to be set up every time. And so I looked into Symphony Commands, and I started making a series of commands. I didn't really understand descriptive naming at the time, so they were start 1, start 2, start 3, start 4. And basically every time I realized that something else needed to be added to the initial server setup for the game, I would just either add it to, because it was kind of like one of the start commands, or I would make a new one. I think I got up to like start 13. Okay, so now that I had the data somewhere I could use it, I was like, all right, now let's start with the most fundamental bits of this to build on top of. And so I went after account creation, and then I knew from looking ahead in the design that there were 2 different character class types, and while I could pretend that you were just going to have one, that wasn't going to be the way it was down the road, so might as well plan for that now. And so I developed simultaneously the 2 different class type paths, very, just the simple bit at first. And one of them is you create a player, and then you create a lord character, and then you create a settlement. And on the other side, it's just you create a player, and then you create a hero, because heroes really aren't into government, and that's the whole point, but anyway. And that included making a bunch of different login types because, of course, this was a learning project for me. And so any like side paths that looked like they were going to be useful skill sets, I went ahead and went after. And so I didn't just make the form login, I also made logins with Facebook and Google and Twitter and Steam. Because why not? Okay, so then I moved on from now we've got players, we've got characters, what are they going to do? And I'm big into crafting, so I started with that. And so I made the mechanisms for them to go out and take the first set of actions that they ever got were harvesting, and then harvesting, processing, and construction. And you can't, it's not like a clean series because you can harvest as a character. You can just go out and press the I'm harvesting button and now I'm harvesting. But in order to process, that's actually reliant on building. So I also had to start implementing the construction process. So you harvest resources, you construct some buildings out of them, you use those buildings to process those resources, and then you can make more complicated buildings. I loved this part because that's my kind of game. But in order for this to work, I suddenly need to invent time within the context of the game. Because construction isn't a matter of you pile up the resources, you click a button, and you get a building. That's beyond unrealistic. That borderlines on not fun. So I needed for building construction to take time, and I needed for the points, action points in this case, that a character would burn harvesting and constructing to come back over time. And I could see ahead, and I knew that this was just the beginning of many, many time-based functions, and so I'm like, well, crap, how do I handle this? And by the way, all of the solutions that I came up with, I'm not saying they're right, they're just what I did. So what I did was I created timed event tables, specifically tables to handle the data needed to process things over time. And I created sort of like a cascade of tables, event week, event day, event hour, and event min, so that you wouldn't actually have to check every single event every single time. You could just check the event week ones like every day, and the event day ones like every hour, and the event hour ones like every 15 minutes, and only be spamming the event min ones that were actually going to expire like right now. And I just put some basic information that was needed in order to execute them when they came up, and then I made a command for checking these timed events, and in order to test them more easily, I made OneTime Command, and I just gave it like a parameter that was weeks, days, hours, or minutes. And then it would process that table as specified and give me back information on what was going on. That was good. And then I made some stuff in crontab for the server to do that for me. I still, it of course executed the command as appropriate for that time period, but I also still relied on that command, just typing it out by hand, like for a million years. Like as long as I was like implementing time-based actions, I needed to be able to test them. Like I will have this expire in 30 seconds, and now I will run the command, and I will see what's going on. That helped. Okay, so at this point, I needed a UI because there were things to do that I needed to check. And so basically my first UI was I made a generic form template fragment, and I made like it be able to handle any form that you dumped in it, not like in a pretty way, but like it would display the form. And so like my entire first UI was like a MUD with web forms. I don't know if you know what a MUD is. Once upon a time, games didn't have pictures, and they were a lot longer play because they were all about the text content, and so the imaginary worlds tended to be a whole lot bigger and let you play a whole lot longer because nobody was worried about pictures. So this is the just generic form processing thing. Okay, so about like a year and a half into this process, I found out that Symphony conferences were a thing. Like I actually found out that tech conferences were a thing. This was not something that I knew, but the friend who had initially designed this game for our company once it had like an interactive portion to it, he suddenly got really interested in what I was doing. He's like, really? You're just gonna make the game? You're just gonna do that? I'm like, what else am I gonna do? Lay here and stare at the ceiling? So he saw this thing that there was going to be a Symphony Live event in San Francisco, and he was like, you should totally go to that. I'm like, how? And he was like, well, do you want to go? And I'm like, yeah. And he was like, post it to social media. So I did. And then a bunch of my friends and family members were like, oh my goodness, there's a thing that you want out of the house bad enough to actually go? Go. And so they, it was actually close enough for me to drive, so it's not like I needed like airfare or anything, but they actually paid for me for my ticket, and they gave me a little bit of a budget, and I was able to get, what do you call that thing where you stay in somebody else's house? That thing. I slept on a couch in a residential warehouse, which was not a thing that I knew existed. My walls were actually sheets hanging from the ceiling. It was pretty cool. So my first Symphony Live event kind of like changed my entire perspective. Like, I didn't know how much I didn't know. Like, I knew it was a lot, but it was like this opaque wall. I didn't know there was a community. I didn't know that people were still using IRC. I was like, I'm 13 again. And I really just didn't know that there was like a community of people that would just like hang out online and talk to each other and share information even though they weren't on the same project, they weren't in the same company, and they didn't care who you were or where you were or what you wanted the information for. They just talked to you. And I was like, so at that point, my life changed a great deal because like every time I hit a wall, it wasn't a matter of, okay, now I'm going to spend 12 hours researching this thing, not even knowing which Google terms I should be searching for. Instead, I would spend like 2 hours doing that, and if I hadn't come up with something useful, I could hit up IRC and be like, hey, why am I not pulling anything up with this search? What word do I need to add? It was fantastic, and I returned totally like inspired and rejuvenated and ready to like tackle the everything because I had so much more data. And so I started looking at what was left. Forums, crafting, training, actions, leveling, ranking, local markets, global markets, game market, fealty, equipping, friendship, enmity, marriage, handfasting, divorce, dueling, diplomacy, scenarios, armies. I'm sure I left some stuff out, but these are the big things. So once I had those done, it was time for the open beta. I really thought I was done. Like really, I really, really thought I was done. I had made all of that happen, and it totally worked for me. Welcome, beta testers. So first of all, I had no idea that this really, really nerdy history game was going to be so instantaneously popular, but oh my goodness, it was. So day one, they destroyed my custom forum system. Destroyed. The amount of posting, I was like, where did you people come from? And why are you talking constantly? Jeez. So I had to rip out the custom forum system basically immediately and replace it with a totally like zombie chopped apart and reassembled PHP BB because it could handle what my custom stuff could not. Thank goodness. So here's the thing about players. They do things differently. I had no idea that I was so tunnel vision doing the exact same things the exact same way every single time, but they pointed this out to me by doing things in ways I could never have possibly managed and breaking everything all the time. They created unprecedented, unimaginable strain, like things that I was sure worked. They totally worked. They worked every time I did them. Well, when 200 people are doing them, they don't work anymore. And they also actually provided design clarity because they would ask things about things that they were finding in the game, interactions that they were doing, and they would be like, is this supposed to be like this? And I would say, yes. And the game designer would say, not at all. So many, many changes happened. Players, especially people that like come on board to beta test a game, they are very into feedback. I got bug reports from the bug report form, which is I had put in for this purpose. I also got reports on the game forums. I got private messages on the game forums. I got forum posts in other forums, not even related to the game, but addressed to me that people would call my attention to because I needed to answer them in some forum I'd never heard of. Valuable information, I did do that. They emailed me, they tweeted at me, they Skyped at me, they Google Plus chatted at me, they Steam chatted at me, and if they had had my home phone number, they'd have called. So with all this valuable feedback coming in, I had to prioritize, because it was not going to all happen at once. Because you get the same level of passion in the feedback from when I do this thing, all construction in my settlement stops and my game has basically blown up in my face and nothing can happen after that, as I really think you should change that font. Like exactly the same level of urgency. And so like it was like all on me to like figure out, all right, so what's actually serious and what can wait possibly forever. Oh, and basically how I did that was like I just did a hierarchy of this prevents you from playing the game is the top level. And after that, this makes it inconvenient for you to play the game. And under that is I just wanted to bother you with stuff. Okay, so now all of the stuff that's gone in, oh, by the way, the first 2 weeks of that beta test, I did not sleep. Not at all. It was a nightmare. Just to keep the game up and running so the valuable, awesome beta testers wouldn't leave. Because you don't want them to leave because like you've already proven you can't test the game by yourself. That's why you did the beta test. So it's important to keep them around. All right, so at this point, what I have is stable, or at least earmarked for what I need to change, and they can keep playing it while I work on these things that aren't actually actively preventing them from playing. And then it's time for me to really re-examine what I know and what I can change to make not only the rest of the implementation, but also maintenance easier. And so I go back and I'm like, all right, what have I learned that I haven't used yet? And one of the things that I looked at was the fact that up until this point, basically everything that I had coded had been in a controller or a command, and that's wrong. So I learned about repositories, I learned about services, I spread my code around to where it was more useful, more reusable, more modular, and it became a whole lot easier to read and a whole lot easier to modify, which was the whole point. So at this point, I start tackling the features that hadn't been thoroughly documented, that I'm like, I don't really understand these, but you know, now the designer has gotten really excited because there are people playing his game, and he's come back on board, and so I'm like, all right, I don't really understand how this works, and he's like, that's because I never finished designing it. I'm like, really? So, because we need that now. And so at this point, I'm getting just-in-time design completion. I'm like, this is what I'm working on. I have this question. He was like, hold on for 2 days while I finish that feature. And this is what I learned. Just-in-time design completion, when you're getting the data like right when you need to implement it, it's not going to be good. It's going to be less flexible, and it's going to be harder to refactor in the future because the longer the concepts sit in your head for, the better the implementation's going to be. Even if you're not spending like every waking minute like thinking about how can I implement this better, just having it there in your head, stewing on it, makes a better implementation in the end. So this stuff at the end that was getting designed right as I was developing it, even though I had all these skills and I was totally able to bang it out and make it work, I wasn't nearly as happy with it as the stuff that I'd been able to like cogitate on for a long time before I actually put the code down. This is also the part where I started deliberate testing, because yeah, I tried testing a couple of times and it had been hard, so I'd like abandoned it completely. But at this point, things were so complicated, and like there were players, so if like I put something new in and it broke everything, there was going to be screaming and I wasn't going to get to sleep anymore. So I started writing tests. And one of the things that really put a lot of pressure on me to start writing like custom tests, I don't mean like unit tests, which are fabulous, but I mean like, no, I really have to do this because nobody's going to be able to do it for me. We're talking about stuff like governmental changes, to where like you can complete a scenario and now in your settlement like you can nominate a bunch of people to run for office, and different people can vote over a certain period of time, and like trials and stuff that are really down the road for players that they're not going to hit up in their first couple of months of playing, might not even hit up in their first year of playing. So I better write some tests. And I did, and that was actually really super fun. In retrospect, I realized that I didn't actually need to make something for players. I could have written an entirely simulated game and been totally satisfied. Okay, so one of the things that the players destroyed was that whole event table crontab thing. Wildly insufficient. Because, like, since I didn't even start testing until this late in the game, they would hit up an action, a time-based action that I had never individually tested, and it would break, and it would crash that timed event, and none of the other events would process, and it also wouldn't get dropped from the table, and so the very next time the event came up, it would do the exact same thing again. It basically just killed the game every time they found a bug, and that was unacceptable. So I was like, how do I fix this? And now I had like a community, and so I could like take a poll. And they were like, what you need is message queuing. And I'm like, what's that? Tell me, Google. And Google did. And so I implemented Rabbitmq, and basically it's message queue. But instead of like text, what I would send the queue would be the command that I wanted it to run when it got around to it. And so I had a bunch of workers all churning through events much more efficiently. And if one broke, I would have a broken worker with a log that told me why it broke. And the rest of the game could go on, and it was great. Huge improvement. Highly recommend. And of course, I also needed to yeah, that's how that works. I just also had to create like a bash script that would say how many workers are we supposed to have, how many workers do we currently have, make those two numbers match. And that was helpful. Oh, and also I just went ahead and put that in a cron tab. So instead of the cron tab trying to handle all timed events, it would just check on the Rabbitmq workers and be like, how you guys doing? Okay, so at this point, there's so much stuff happening without direct player interaction. Like they do something, or 5 people would do something, or the game would do something, and it would trigger something else happening like down the road. And so I needed, this is another thing I didn't anticipate until it was actually happening. The players wanted to know what was going on all the time. They like would play all day, and they would want to know when things happened right then. Not like play for 5 minutes, go away, come back, see updates. No, they wanted to know like right then. And so I had to develop some immediate gratification interactions, both with each other and with the game. So I implemented a chat system, and that was really fun because I got to think about things like, well, what if somebody is spamming you and you would like them to stop? So I got to implement like block features and stuff like that. It was cool. And like groups, because they're like different groups and guilds and stuff that you can commit, and they all get chat rooms, and like your settlement gets a chat room and all this stuff. It was very, very fun. And of course, at the top, you can see I implemented notifications, very Facebooky, but way too many notifications for just one panel. So I split it up into categories, like the little castle guy is like civil updates, like a building has finished being constructed. And then there is like piles of money, and that's, market things have happened. And then there's like the happy, sad theater masks, and that's like human interaction type things, and then there's just like a little bust statue guy, and that's like things that have nothing to do with anything but your character. And so players were pretty happy about that. Okay, so like I said, the designer kind of came back a couple years into this, and got really excited that it looked like it was possible, because like when we'd had the company, I'd been like, hey, let's make a game small enough that I can make it with my limited skill set, and he'd been like, that will never work. So a couple years into that, he was like, okay, maybe that would work. But his girlfriend at the time had really been wanting to get into like Unity 3D development, and I was like, well, why don't I just tack on an API to this thing, and you can just worry about learning the front end stuff? And she was like, yes. And so I was like, cool, done. And so like it was actually like, I'm not saying it's a good API, but it is an API that I tagged onto the front of the engine so that she could basically just make a non-web-based Unity 3D front end, and it was the same server. It's it's all my engine just handling it, and all she has to do is like send me information as if she was a web page and process the data I give back, and it actually is looking pretty nice. This is just the menu for one of the versions of that. Okay, so we're getting to the denouement. Deployment never happened. We had all these ideas for deployment, like how we were going to like distribute the weight based on like settlements. Like at a certain size, a settlement would automatically spin up its own server, and if a settlement got abandoned below a certain level of interaction, it would get absorbed into the central server. That sort of thing. We had lots of ideas. We were thinking about it. Estimates are hard. So one of the problems is I kept thinking that I knew enough about what was left to be able to say, this is when we're going to be done, and then we can launch right after that. And I kept being wrong. I kept being like, I'm done. And the game designer kept me like, no, you're not. One of the big problems that I had was I don't care about combat. And combat is a really big part of the game. So I'd been like, yeah, it's totally done. They'd be like, have you tested combat? It doesn't work at all. I'm like, I don't care. But everybody else did, so. But I made it work. Okay, so at this point we are in the magic and dreams section of the game development. We did have all of these ideas for how we were going to do things, and part of it had to do with determining at what point player investment would be sufficient for them to start giving us money, because as long as it was just the web game, and as long as it was just about 200 beta testers, I could come up with the amount of money to pay DigitalOcean every month. That was okay. But like, as soon as we launched a for real game, you get a whole different level of interest, and we had to figure out whether or not there was gonna be money to pay for the hardware necessary to serve that, or if we were just gonna like serve and die. Just like, so we were still having discussions on that. So you may remember at the beginning of this that the whole point was that I really didn't like being crippled and poor. And so at some point, I started looking for jobs. I'd be like, I've done a lot of code things. And I actually started speaking at tech conferences, like, not talks like this. This is the softest talk I've ever given. With like tutorials, things I'd learned, because since I started from nothing I can make a web page. At the beginning of this process, like everything that I'd learned over the course of those years, I'd pretty much learned from scratch, and so I give a pretty good tutorial, like not here because you guys know all that stuff, but in general. And so I'd been a tech speaker for a couple of years, and I'd made a lot of code happen, and so I started being like, anybody want to hire me? And actually at the beginning of this year, someone did. And so I stopped being poor, and that was really nice. And like, healthcare is cool, and I'm actually a cyborg. I don't know if you know that or not, but, and I've gotten cyborg upgrades. I've got this really nice back brace. I've got this thing that electrocutes me all the time. It's fantastic. So I didn't stop development when I got the job. I got really invested in the game. I kind of love it. And so not only did I keep working on it in my free time, I actually continued to put money into the designer and his girlfriend making the pretty 3D thing, which players seemed to think was awesome. I was like, whatever you want, that's fine. So that was cool for a while, and I got to move out on my own for the first time in my adult life. I have my own place, and I love it. It's just a little apartment, but it's mine. It's fantastic. But then, okay, so partway through this, the game designer sort of said, we need an LLC to own this game. And I'm like, whatever, don't care. And he was like, here, sign this. And I'm like, whatever, don't care. And then it turns out that what I'd signed made it like a member-managed company with him being the managing member, which kind of made it like a dictatorship with him in charge. I didn't know that. So at some point, I was living on my own. They were living on their own. I'm making money. I then changed jobs to make even more money, because why wouldn't you do that? And they kept wanting more money, and I'm like, no. But then they'd be like, oh my God, there's this horrible crisis. We need money. And I'd be like, oh my God, horrible crisis, here's money. But then like it just kept being more, and I'm like, guys, I have to pay taxes next year. You're like, I need to put this in savings. This is getting crazy. And they didn't care, or didn't believe me, or I don't know, whatever. And so eventually I was like, this has to stop. And I like talked to a lawyer. I'm like, what are my legal options? And they were like, you don't have any. So like we ended up having this series of arguments. Like I'm like, I want to open source the game like we've always talked about. And they were like, no. And I was like, the server is the most important thing. We have to keep it up forever. That's why we decided to make it a web why I decided to make it a web project, because then it's cheap enough for us to maintain forever, and that is awesome. And they were like, drop the server. So like eventually things just got so crazy that I had to walk away from the game. And now the server is down and there's nothing I can do about it. The source code, the millions and millions of lines of code that I made, are still under an account that the designer owns, and I can't open source it. I can't do anything about it. And so basically, I walk away with nothing but my skill set. So I guess the important lesson here is really pay attention to who you're entering projects with, because it may be a bigger deal than you think. But in the end, I can make another game. I'm thinking probably going to do that. Probably less with the pictures. I think I'm just going to make a straight up BBS mud this time. Why not? That's it. If anybody has any questions, that would be okay now, or you can email me or talk to me on Twitter or IRC, because I live there again. Any questions now, or you just want to get in touch on the internet? Because that's where I normally live. Awesome.